Kindness rarely disappears overnight. More often, it withdraws quietly after being stretched too far for too long. If you've ever felt this shift in yourself or someone close to you, stay with this reflection for a moment. There is a particular kind of change that becomes more visible after 50. Someone who was once patient, generous, and emotionally available begins to feel distant. Their warmth is still there, but harder to reach. Their responses become shorter, their availability more selective. And to those who remember who they used to be, it can feel sudden, even unsettling. But what appears to be coldness is often something else entirely. It is not the loss of kindness. It is the reorganization of it. For many years, kind people tend to give without keeping score. They listen when others need to talk. They show up when it matters. They absorb tension, smooth over conflict, and make space for other people's emotions, often at the expense of their own. And for a long time, they do this willingly, even naturally, because being needed feels meaningful, because being dependable feels like love. But over decades, something accumulates quietly beneath that generosity. Fatigue, not the kind that comes from a long day, but the kind that comes from a long pattern, from always being the one who understands, the one who forgives, the one who adjusts, the one who carries emotional weight that was never fully shared. And eventually, the body and mind begin to respond, not with anger, but with withdrawal. One of the earliest signs of this shift is reduced emotional availability. Where they once leaned in, they now step back, not because they no longer care, but because caring has come to feel costly. Conversations that once felt natural now feel draining. Repeated patterns that once felt manageable now feel heavy. Another sign is a quiet intolerance for imbalance. They begin to notice things they used to overlook: one-sided effort, lack of appreciation, subtle dismissiveness. And instead of explaining it away, they simply stop engaging in the same way. There is also a shift in boundaries. For much of their lives, kind people often operated with flexible boundaries. They said yes when it was inconvenient. They made room when they were already full. But after 50, those boundaries begin to solidify. Not loudly, not aggressively, but firmly. And to those who are used to their constant availability, this can feel like rejection. But it is not rejection. It is self-preservation. If you've ever experienced this shift within yourself, becoming quieter, more selective, less emotionally accessible, you might reflect on when you first began to feel tired of giving more than you received. What makes this transformation difficult for others to understand is that it is rarely explained out loud. Kind people don't always announce their limits. They simply start honoring them. They stop initiating conversations that feel one-sided. They no longer chase connection when it isn't returned. They withdraw from dynamics that require them to overextend. And because there is no confrontation, no dramatic moment, the change appears sudden, from the outside. But internally, it has been building for years. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this shift. After decades of experience, kind people begin to see patterns more clearly. They recognize when their generosity has been mistaken for obligation, when their patience has been interpreted as tolerance for behavior that should have been addressed, when their silence has allowed others to remain unchanged. And this realization carries a quiet weight, not resentment exactly, but a form of clarity that cannot be undone. At this stage of life, time is no longer something they feel they can spend carelessly. Energy becomes more valuable. Emotional investment becomes more intentional. And the idea of continuing in relationships that feel unbalanced begins to lose its appeal. So they adjust, not to punish others, but to protect what remains of their emotional energy. Around this point, it's worth pausing to consider. Have you ever mistaken someone's quiet withdrawal for indifference, when it may have been exhaustion? There is a common misunderstanding that kindness should always look the same, that a kind person should remain endlessly patient, endlessly giving, endlessly available. But this expectation overlooks something essential. Kindness without boundaries becomes depletion, and depletion, over time, changes behavior. What looks like coldness is often a boundary that was delayed for too long, a space that should have been created years earlier, a limit that is finally being respected, not by others, but by the person themselves. And once this shift happens, it is rarely reversed. Not because the person has hardened, but because they have learned. They have learned that not every relationship is reciprocal, that not every effort is valued, that not every connection deserves the same level of access. And this learning reshapes how they show up. They may still be kind, but more selectively. They may still care, but more quietly. They may still give, but only where it feels mutual. To those who are accustomed to their old way of being, this can feel like a loss. The easy access, the constant support, the unspoken understanding, it is no longer there in the same way. But from the inside, it feels different. It feels like relief, a calm that comes from no longer overextending, a steadiness that comes from knowing when to step back, a quiet sense of dignity that replaces the need to always be the one who gives more. If this reflection brings to mind someone who seems to have changed in this way, you might gently consider what they may have experienced before that change became visible. Because often, what looks like distance is the result of years of closeness that was never fully returned. If this perspective resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who may have quietly gone through the same shift. Peak Mind Lab thanks you for listening and being part of this reflection. In the end, kind people do not become cold without reason. They become careful. They become aware. They become selective in ways they perhaps should have been earlier in life. And while their warmth may no longer be freely available to everyone, it has not disappeared. It has simply found its boundaries. And within those boundaries, it becomes something deeper. Not just kindness, but self-respect.